Yeah, as you said yourself, it's a key institution. Some would say the key institution, others would say one of the key institutions. Of course, we have to look at different areas of policies, but for example, in crisis situation, it's quite clear that the European Council is the key institution. And so far, it's relevant for understanding how this European Union and the institutional architecture of the European Union works. In academic, it's important to study the performance of the European Council and also the structure. Generally, for those who study, let's say, the traditional theoretical approaches, would argue the European Council is the intergovernmental part, whereas the European Parliament and the Commission and the Court are more the supranational part. I think this is a good starting point, but not sufficient for understanding the European Council, because the European Council is intergovernmental in nature, you would call that, and but at the end takes quite a lot of decisions which have made and is making the European Union more supranational. In the respective article in the treaty, it's rather vague. They should give the general directions and set priorities. It's mentioned, and that's interesting, that it should have no legislative power. So somewhere it's located outside the classical institutional division of labor, division of competence, division of power. In other articles, for example, for treaty revision or for structuring the work of the Council, you see that the European Council has got quite a lot of concrete tasks for electing other functions, for example, for proposing the President of the Commission or for nominating the High Representative. So in the treaty, there are a couple of other, let's say, major functions. For me, most important is that we see that beside what is put in the treaties, what you might call the legal words, you see the real world. That means the European Council quite often does more than you find in the treaty. I mentioned already the crisis management, where you don't find directly proper legal articles to support or to put, let's say, to explain the function of the European Council. They take then decisions which are changing what the European Union is doing. The European Council has, since the 80s, also made major decisions de facto on the Union's budget. And again, in the respective articles in the treaty, you will not find the European Council mentioned really for doing that. So besides the legal powers, you have to look at the real performances of the European Council. And there you see that the European Council is more important than you would look than just looking at the treaty itself. Yeah, like in many other issues of European policies in general, if there is a major point of major relevance or major conflict, somehow member states want that the European Council, that means the heads of state and government, should deal with this issue. You find that in relations with the United States, with Russia, you find it in the climate policy, energy policy, in the crisis management. And the relations between the Union and Turkey, or Turkey with the European Union and with certain members of the European Union, that means with Cyprus and Greece, has become so important, so also conflictual, that, let's say, the European Council is asked by some of its members to take a position on that. The European Council in the history has also made the steps to invite Turkey to become member of the European Union and started the negotiation of membership. This process is now, let's say, put in the refrigerator, you might call it. It's not, let's say, abandoned, officially abandoned, but it's more or less stopped. And again, to restart it, it would need the European Council to take a decision, which in the moment you would not expect that it would do so. Yeah, I think for students who want to understand how this European Union, and then with that, how the Europe or West, yeah, it's a major part of Europe, not only Western Europe, like in the beginning, develops, evolves inside Europe, but also its role in the international system, its position in the competition between superpowers. It's, let's say, you see that the European Council plays a major role in trying to find common positions. And that there you can see very clearly national positions. Sometimes they are convergent, sometimes they can be put into one position, and sometimes it's more difficult to do so. But therefore, if you want to understand this Europe today, and perhaps in the last 50 years, to look at the European Council is a major way to get a certain understanding of that of Europe, I would call it, not just of the European Union, but of Europe in more general terms. And of course, for, let's say, academic purposes, it's important to see in which theoretical framework, or by which theoretical framework, you can explain this European Council. I mentioned already the intergovernmental supranational approaches. You find different schools of thought, for example, about intergovernmentalism. You find something like liberal intergovernmental, neo-intergovernmentalism. You find different schools of supranational ideas. You find schools which use a principal agent approach. I personally like also to mention what I call the fusion approach. That means I understand the European Council as an engine to merge national and European instruments, that there is some kind of shared way to deal with issues on the agenda. So that's for me, therefore, if you want to have a broader view about developments and explanations, the European Council is a very good object to prove or disprove, to verify or falsify certain theoretical approaches. Yeah, I think for one thing, you should look also at the structure of the European Council. That means especially the role of the president of the European Council, who is now full-time president, no more the rotating presidency of member states, and what he can do or cannot do, the constraints and opportunities, and also of the internal power structure. You find there are smaller and larger member states. You find in certain areas of high importance the Franco-German tandem. You find that sometimes northern countries are having different positions than southern countries, or eastern countries now play a different role than some of the western countries. So especially for political scientists, looking at power and how institutions can find a consensus, the European Council is of high interest, and it's not simple to find good explanations, because that's one of the problems, that it's very difficult to follow what they are doing inside the meeting. There is no outside observer there. You might get certain anecdotes, but there's still limit. Members of the Council keep a high degree of confidentiality, nice word, confidentiality, and you don't know what happens before the meetings. So who calls whom, who meets whom before, and of course the President of the European Council plays a major role in that, to find, let's say, consensus positions to get people together. So I think that's highly relevant for understanding against the European Council, and with the European Council, the Europe in general, European Union and Europe in general. As I said, for a good, sound analysis, you have difficulties to find sometimes the empirical evidence. So that makes a difference, for example, to the European Parliament, and to a certain degree also to the Council, where in the European Parliament, this is more transparent, how decisions are made, who is for and against certain positions. why you find consensus or not. And in the European Council, that's more difficult to follow. I would like also to mention another issue, which I think is very important, again, because the European Council is so powerful. It's what is the legitimacy of this body? The European Parliament or members of the European Parliament quite often complain that these are, let's say, just national politicians who take decisions and do not take into account that the European Parliament is directly elected by the citizens of the European Union. So it's intransparent, and somebody said there is a dictatorship by this European Council and the European Union. I share that there is not much transparency. That's, I think, quite clear. But I would like to mention a definition of democracy, which is called consensus democracy, that in many democracies, it's not just the majority and transparency, but that different stakeholders have to find a common solution to points. We have seen that, let's say, if I take the German case, very clearly now in the pandemic, where you see that, let's say, the national level and the regional level have to find common solutions. And we find that's the same in the European Union and in the European Council. So my argument is the European Council at the end can contribute to the legitimacy of the European Union overall by really merging national interests and having the major national politicians, the national leaders, if you want, sitting around the table. So my argument is, yes, there is no few transparency. That's not what democratic processes should look like. At the same time, it offers some kind of consensus, which you don't find otherwise, and where I think it would be difficult if the European Council would work more transparent in this sense. So there's an ongoing dilemma, if you want, in this sense, which is difficult to solve in the moment.